What fact about history will never be taught in school? Captain Bartholomew Roberts the pirate gave his pirate crew a bedtime. Go to have your 8 hours so you can make that pillaging tomorrow. Well, until I saw Lincoln, I had never heard of Thaddeus Stevens, who seems to be a much greater believer in the equality of men than many. The Tulsa Race Massacre. In the early 1920s, Tulsa, Oklahoma had a very affluent black neighborhood called Black Wall Street. Basically, many African Americans were doing better financially than whites. White folks were angry about their success and wanted their land. An African American was wrongly accused of assault by a white girl, and the whites used this as an excuse to attack the neighborhood, including dropping bombs from World War I era planes. Many were killed and beaten. Over 10,000 people were left homeless due to houses and businesses being burned down. This is the greatest single incident of racial violence in US history. That Argentina pretty much eliminated the black race. They had ways to get rid of the men first. Not as much for the women though. Once the male to female ratio drastically dropped, black population, the women were pretty much forced to sleep with white men in order to wash out the black. The black population was so low, the Argentine government pretty much removed the black option as a race. Crazy how they succeed. Hitler's nephew served for the US in World War II. Ben Franklin once wrote a thorough essay about how it's better to date older women. The US government went to war in Guatemala over bananas. That you need to remove the whole good guys and bad guys mentality and actually learn to accept different moral standards of the past. For example, in UK schools, when the empire is covered, it's from a perspective of how bad and evil it was. Yet when it comes to Romans, Saxons, Vikings, etc., it's more about what happened and the consequences without any direct judgment given. The Romans are covered for their historical impact to the British Isles, not condemned for their brutal suppression of the natives. Vice versa. In World War II, it's all about how great the Allies were in defeating the Axis. They would never cover stuff such as the Dresden bombings. Literally anything to do with Polynesian history. Native Americans weren't granted citizenship until the 1920s. How much in common we have with people of the past. Pictures, sculptures and carvings going all the way back, showing sex, drugs, drinking, partying and graffiti that you would see on an abandoned building or train today. The plight of the middle class and class struggles versus the upper class is the same today as for thousands of years. If we could listen to a court jester, their jokes would ring true today more than likely. Outside of technology making things faster, easier in a sense, we're still enjoying complaining about most of the same things we have been for millennia. Those who ignore history are doomed to repeat it, and there's nothing new under the sun is real. Chinese Express Wu Zixin required people to please her orally as a greeting. How bad the abuse of Nanking was. About the lost children of Francoism. These children were abducted from Republican parents who were either in jail or had been assassinated by nationalist troops during the Spanish Civil War in Francoist Spain. These children were then given to families that would practice Catholicism and nationalism. However, this lasted after 1975. When Franco died, by then this practice was already a trafficking business run by nuns, doctors and nurses. My mum is a lost children and she has told me that almost anyone has found their parents. The Japanese military kidnapped hundreds, if not thousands, of Korean and Chinese women during World War II and forced them to be sex workers for the Japanese military. Some Japanese women were even drafted to be comfort women. But they didn't know what they were being drafted for until they were there. It's actually a pretty common thing in many wars, because the military wants to keep the soldiers pure by kidnapping these women. They know that they aren't riddled with STDs. It's very sad, especially because when the war is over, many of the camps are cleared and these women are forced to find their way back home without even knowing the war is over. If they aren't too afraid or ashamed to go back home, they're usually turned away from their families because they are so ashamed of what happened. How there was a time called 2020 and people went crazy buying all the toilet paper, but forgot the condoms, and that, kiddies, is how you were made. Turkey genocided Armenians. How Britain and France screwed up the Middle East for 120 years. Okay, I got a bit of backlash for this post. Yes, while the Middle East could have changed this, the French and British definitely did contribute to their instability. Hitler gave his soldiers meth because it was performance enhancing. Most of the world was really into butt-sex until the Abrahamic religions took over. It took me an anthropology class in college to learn about human zoos. That is, zoos where white people paid money to see Aboriginal people from various regions in cages. It happened all over the world, including in the Bronx Zoo in, like, the 1920s. I had never heard about anything like that in any schooling before that, and I doubt most people have. World War I equals the Great War Part 1. World War II equals the Great War Part 2. The Cold War equals the Great War Part 3. Proxy wars. The War on Terror equals the Great War Part 4. 100 years later and it's still ongoing. Korean comfort girls and women who were forced to be sex slaves to the Japanese soldiers before and during World War II. That the Middle Eastern countries were more involved in the African slave trade, and it continues to this day to some extent. Also that the USA was not even close to a quarter of the slave trade, but it is the most publicized slavery tale. Also, poor white people were slaves from 250 BC, documented, until the early 1700s. They were slaves to kingdoms. Also, they were tortured and left tied to trees in the forest, if not outright killed or lynched. Gandhi was kind of a dumb asshole. If you go back far enough, everyone's ancestry contains abuse at some point. Stalin's son killed himself in a concentration camp, yet Stalin mocked him until his death. My Chinese tour guides who were in their mid-20s did not know about the Tiananmen Square massacre and Tank Man. They looked at us time we had 3 heads when we asked about us during our visit. The Heart of Darkness is based in the Congo Free State, which was presided over by King Leopold I of Belgium. Conrad wrote the story in part as a critique not just of European imperialism but also of the atrocities and crimes against humanity perpetuated during that time. It is estimated that between 5 and 10 million of a roughly 20 million population died during Belgian rule of the Congo Free State due to a combination of famine, disease, and forced labor. Belgium enriched itself through forced slavery and coercion, using strict quotas for the harvest of natural rubber, and an individual failing to meet a quota was punishable by death. For me personally, we read the book in high school, but we never learned the historical context or about King Leopold's part in all of this. There was no famine in Ireland, it was genocide. A lot of people that didn't pay attention in history class. In America, you're not going to hear a lot about the shady shit the US government did to its own citizens in the 1950s and 1960s. Project MKUltra was the code name of a secret CIA program that involved all sorts of crazy shit that most Americans have heard of but don't really know a lot of details about. And some of the stuff done under this program is so unbelievably weird that MKUltra is a punchline in some circles. And that's just the one that's common knowledge. There were programs set up where the government would inject uranium into people without telling them in order to see the effects. Sometimes directly into their sexual organs. You need to dig deep into some weird rabbit holes to find information about stuff like this. And a lot of time you need to sift through all sorts of conspiracy theory BS in order to find the actual story. And even then you can't be 100% certain that what you uncovered is real or fake. But even so, it's pretty well established that in the 1960s in particular the US government was up to its elbows in some pretty bad stuff involving its own citizens. And you'll never hear anything about it even in college level courses unless you have some really groovy instructors. Many of them, the winners, write history. That the Atlantic slave trade was fed by fierce African tribes enslaving and then trading off less fierce African tribes to the ships that took them to the colonies. Europeans kept dying of disease when trying to penetrate too far inland in Africa. Coastal Africans would capture slaves, or acquire them by trade themselves, and then trade them to the Europeans for manufactured goods, and cowrie shells, I guess. Anything to do with Sumerian culture. I think this is something that generally isn't taught. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. I learned about it in middle school. Then a professor mentioned it in college and no one else in my class heard of it. Then I stumbled upon an article to use as a teacher. None of my co-workers had ever heard of it. It's had a huge impact on safety regulations. Edit. Apparently my district just failed. I'm glad so many of you have learned about it. Hitler modeled the Holocaust after the way Democrat Andrew Jackson kicked the American Indians off their land with the Trail of Tears. War crimes your own country committed. How Polish pilots helped to prevent the invasion of Britain during World War II, nor how Britain and France failed to meet the support agreement. The CIA proposed committing a false flag terror attack which included shooting down a fake passenger jet as an excuse to invade Cuba. JFK rejected the operation. That Franklin Roosevelt supported Mussolini and said something along the lines of how he wished he could emulate him back home. Obviously, we can ignore the rest of the effort that the US put into helping the Nazis. Both Roosevelt and Stalin wanted to execute every single captured German soldier. Winston Churchill nipped that in the bud and said something like, "No, I will never execute somebody for fighting for their country." The US was responsible for hundreds, if not thousands, of rapes throughout Europe during World War II. The only people ever charged were black people. The US tried to enforce racial segregation within the UK and Australia during World War II, even going as far as ensuring that they did not purchase from any shop that sold anything to black people. This resulted in countless fights between British and American soldiers. One American died in Australia as a result of these fights. The black Americans stayed hanging around with the British and Australian soldiers, which had minimal racism. Central Park, in New York, was created under eminent domain and raised a predominantly black and Irish community called Seneca Village. Most of the inhabitants were compensated, but many felt they did not receive fair market value. More than, according to the Louise Chipley Slavacek, author of New York's Central Park, the pro-park lobby were largely affluent merchants, bankers and landowners, who wanted a fashionable and safe public place where they and their families could mingle and promenade. One source. John Wilkes Booth's brother saved Lincoln's son Robert Todd Lincoln. Robert Lincoln was traveling by train from New York to Washington. He got off the train during a stop at Jersey City. He saw that the platform was extremely crowded. In order to be polite and wait his turn, he pressed his back to one of the train's cars. About 30-60 seconds later, the train started to move. The train wiped him down and dropped him into the space between the platform and train. Abe's son would have died if a stranger hadn't yanked him out of the hole by his collar. The stranger was Edwin Booth, a good actor in the 19th century and the brother of John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth was the guy that killed Abe only a few years later. Lots of historical figures were gay. The person that most of us know as gay was Sappho, who wrote many poems about her love for women. In fact, Sappho lived on the island of Lesbos, which is why we call homosexual women lesbians today. But there are also people that you didn't expect, like Leonardo da Vinci, who was accused of sodomy with a male prostitute among some other stuff. One of my personal favorite gay historical figures were Alexander Hamilton and John Lawrence. No, I'm not about to spout things from the Hamilton musical. The two wrote letters with some very spicy language in which Hamilton proclaims his love for John on numerous occasions. Some parts of these letters were so spicy that future biographers, such as one of Hamilton's sons, cut and crossed out certain parts. The facts that were never recorded and the facts that were recorded but destroyed. African history gets pretty crazy. I'm writing a paper right now about how the British handpicked Idi Amin to run Uganda after Uganda had been independent for almost 10 years. Idi Amin ended up being a brutal dictator who killed about 500,000 people in Uganda. The British contributed and may have even facilitated the overthrow of Milton Obote in favor of Amin because Obote was introducing policies that would take away British companies that were being used to exploit Uganda for resources. History, at least when I was taught, has a Western bias. We tend to teach when we discovered certain things or developed certain theories, when we weren't necessarily the first. That's understandable, because that's how we learned those things. However, in a lot of cases there were Arabic, Indian, or Asian scholars who had very similar theories or even discovered things before we did. It gives us Westerns a kind of bias where we think we invented science and astronomy and maths, when that's not really the case at all. It was happening all over the world. Apparently that the Democrats of 1860 are not the same, in any way, as the Democrats of today. In Rochester, New York, a huge white wolf went around eating people and hurting people. My dad just told me. Also, I don't know who created my own town but know who created legalism. The massacre of Poles in Volhynia and eastern Galicia. Over 130,000 Polish civilians murdered in horrific ways at the hands of the UPA, Ukrainian Insurgent Army, and the ANB, Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, in about 2 years, from 1943 to 45. That the UK caused a famine in Bengal, India during World War II, killing over 2 million indigenous people. The population of the Native Americans when the first explorers arrived in North America was believed to have rivaled that of Europe at the time, in the tens of millions. Those same explorers exterminated upwards of 95% of the Native Americans simply by showing up and sharing their infectious bugs with the natives. The intercommunication between tribes assured they spread across the continent. So, by the time more explorers and colonists returned years and years later, they found an almost pristine wilderness with sparse populations, ripe for colonizing. The US government continued genocide against Native American people well into the 70s by utilizing forced sterilization. Slavery didn't happen just hundreds of years ago. There are black people in their 90s that remember picking cotton for white men specifically. After the female Jews were freed from the concentration camps, it was common for the Soviet troops to abuse them. Every detail that makes the country of origin look bad. The My Lai massacre, look it up. US troops slaughtered a ton of innocent men, women, and children. Absolutely disgusting. The Nanking massacre I found to be particularly horrible and gory, however I didn't get the opportunity to learn about many atrocities that happened pre-World War II until I had gotten out of high school. I don't know about never, but this month I'd say all of them. Biafra, the Nigerian Civil War. The torturous ways you could be killed in the Middle Ages. The fact that the British Empire caused the troubles that are in Kashmir today. How the American Indians were massacred to near extinction in savage and brutal ways, many ways which are considered war crimes today. The IWW and the Haymarket bombing. Anything about Emmett Till's murder. It sparked the equal rights desegregation movement. Seriously, look it up. His death makes the Mitchell Brown case look like a cakewalk. The US government actively campaigned for, and funded, the reintegration of actual Nazis into higher-level government and scientific positions post-World War II. Sweden once had the 30th of February. The Battle of Scrooge Farms. The Irish potato famine was a mass genocide by the British. It wasn't because spuds were dying. You will never get taught this in school. It's a pity. The wolves being reintroduced into Yellowstone National Park after years of being extinct. Helen Keller was a die-hard socialist. The United Kingdom's real history to English kids. It is believed that Leonardo da Vinci was gay. In fact, in 1476 he was accused of sodomy by an anonymous. Anything remotely related to our involvement in basically all of South America in the 60s 90s. I am absolutely blown away at the lack of knowledge in this subject by anyone. I hardly know a single person who understands all the we pulled in South America and Southeast Asia. That had to be one of the most insane times in US history in terms of undercover ops and some absolutely diabolical plans. The true history of genocide and colonization of indigenous peoples in Canada. Never taught when I was in high school. The Philippine-American War. People forget America was a colonial power. Alexander Hamilton got caught on a sex scandal with some dude's wife. There's a whole drunk history video on it. The fact that not only white people owned slaves. I'm a high school history teacher. More history is paraphrased. So much is not taught. The emphasis is on skills instead of content. In American Civil War history, the Union, especially Abraham Lincoln, are often portrayed as kindly, benevolent liberators freeing slaves from the evil South. In reality, the average person in the Union was very racist by modern standards. There were also quite a few Southern sympathizers living in the Union. It's much simpler and prettier to teach it as this black and white, everyone on this side of the line is immoral and everyone on this side is good. The Move bombing. 1985. Move was a black liberation, animal rights and anarchist group that resided in a compound in Philadelphia. There is no evidence that their leaders were violent or dominating towards their members. They demonstrated against animal cruelty, racism and capitalism. FBI bombed their compound. I got a 241. 1. The fact that the USA started the Cuban Missile Crisis. In America it's taught that the Russians started it, and then we had a secret meeting with Khrushchev, sorry for spelling, and we both agreed to remove our missiles. 2. That the US got their asses handed to them by the Philippines over their independence and we brushed it off as if it never happened. The censored part of Anne Frank's diaries. One of the Russian queens had a bed with giant phalluses as the bedposts. That a lot of those very facts are subjective depending on viewpoint. One man's hero is another man's villain. The list is endless. Although they mostly did brilliant things. Churchill, World War I a disaster. Cromwell, murdered innocent villagers and Dragida Island. Mandela, involved in low-level armed struggle that bombed innocent citizens. Napoleon, well, he was responsible for so many bad military decisions it's hard to know where to start. Leading his men into the siege of Moscow is a good one though. Anyways, you get my drift. Two sides to every story. Christopher Columbus and his crew were murderers, rapists, and thieves. But hey, let's teach all the kids he invented Thanksgiving, discovered a continent, and cooked a big old turkey for the natives. That history only repeats itself if you don't learn from history. There was an armed coup against a legally elected government in Wilmington, NC. That we as humans ducked up real big. For Canada, the horrors of residential schools. These, basically, re-education camps went on until the mid-1990s. Kill the savage, save the man. They will not say for sure that they rewrite history every time the authorities change.